Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack a really fascinating analysis of our modern world. The sources we're looking at cover everything from the fall of the Berlin Wall right up to today's headlines, all through the very distinct lens of a biblical worldview.
Okay, so here's what we're going to cover. We'll kick things off by setting the stage with the New World Order. Then, we'll dive into this clash between two huge ideas, globalism and populism. After that, we'll take a look at the wild card, the China factor. And finally, we're going to wrap it all up with the biblical framework that underpins this entire analysis.
All right, let's jump into our first section, a new world order. So you have to go back to 1991. The Soviet Union dissolves, and just like that, the world changes. It fundamentally reshaped the entire globe.
You know, with the Cold War officially over, the United States was left standing in a position of totally unmatched global influence. It's a period that some of our source materials refer to as U.S. unipolarity. So that really raises the big question, right? If the fight against communism was over, what would be the next big conflict? Well, these sources suggest the main battle wasn't going to be between nations anymore. It was shifting to a battle of ideas and worldviews. And from the perspective of our source material, this whole shift wasn't just some random political event. It was seen as highlighting a key theological idea, that God is sovereign over the rise and fall of nations. Okay, so this new era really set the stage for the rapid rise of an ideology known as globalism. So what is globalism? Well, the sources basically define it as this whole process of linking the world together, through business, through technology, with things like the European Union and trade deals like NAFTA being prime examples of this push for integration. And you can really see the momentum here. Throughout the 90s and early 2000s, you had these major milestones just pushing nations closer and closer together, economically and politically. Now, the analysis points to the Obama presidency as a really key time for advancing this vision, and not just on an economic level, but on a cultural one too, through policies that the sources describe as fundamentally redefining moral and spiritual truth.
But a big push in one direction often gets a big pushback, and that's exactly what happened here. A really powerful counter-movement emerged, which the documents label as populism.
So the sources really frame this as a head-to-head clash. You've got globalism pushing for more integration, open borders, a shared culture, versus populism, which is all about defending the nation-state, securing borders, and putting your own country first. And of course, this populist feeling was really personified, according to these documents, in the rise of Donald Trump. He tapped directly into a sentiment among voters who felt like they'd been completely left behind by what they saw as globalist elites. The sources describe this movement as a kind of populist awakening, a pushback against a centralized global agenda. And it's interesting, they even connect this modern movement to the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, suggesting that defending national borders and sovereignty is actually a principle that protects against global tyranny. So, while all this back and forth between globalism and populism was happening in the West, you had another huge player on the world stage charting its own very different course. Our source material presents China as this really unique case, right? Here's a nation that embraced capitalist-style markets, starting with Deng Xiaoping, but did it all while staying under the rigid control of a one-party, officially atheist communist government. And this is the big takeaway here. China's rise completely challenges that classic Western assumption that capitalism and democracy have to go hand in hand. They proved you could have one without the other. All right, so let's move to our final section. This is where we pull all those threads together and look at the overarching biblical framework the sources use to interpret all of these global trends. This verse from Proverbs pops up again and again in the documents, and the core argument being made is pretty straightforward, that a nation's moral and spiritual condition is directly tied to its strength and stability, maybe even more so than its economic or military power. So what's the takeaway from this framework? Well, the sources boil it down to these key actions. First, recognizing God's ultimate control over nations. Second, pursuing national righteousness as the real foundation for strength. And third, placing your ultimate hope not in any political system, but in the church. And that leaves us with a final thought from this whole analysis. It really challenges us to stop and think about how our own worldview, whatever it might be, shapes how we understand things like power, trade, and what a nation's ultimate purpose really is.